One of the things that had me first think about archivism is um, in the olden days, there was quite a lot of software that was available and it was pirated. And it was pirated and it was passed to a limited degree compared to now, around on floppies physically, in something called a sneaker net, where people would physically go and visit friends and say, hey, I got this, I found this. And through the pre-internet dial-up BBS bulletin board system, which would let one person post up stuff, arbitrary files, and other people could download it from wherever, often in the world, as long as they could afford either the long distance call, or there was like a chain of telephone calls that let places pass files around from one side of a country to the next and skirt the then quite significant long distance fees. Again, pre-internet. And what ended up happening was there was the creation of a culture of not exactly the exclusivity of having and giving software, but something like a recognition of that need. There will be newness. Everybody was young and everybody was poor. And so if you got a piece of software, you appreciated it, you held on to it, you used it, if you paid for it, and if you got a copy of something that somebody else paid for it, then you recognized its kind of uniqueness. And so you'd have some friend of yours would get something, would share it out, and then it would be shared out and would be shared out. And there was an environment of that caring, and it set a kind of tone for software users. And it was there that a lot of the seeds of antagonism between software developers, lawyers, even government level stuff, they'd be antagonistic to software users, in just users in general, not just these people they would label criminals, and they would criminalize all this stuff. And that's the correct thing to do, right? So this is the intellectual, the economic, the business effort of some company somewhere out there, and it made a thing. It made a product, and it sold the product, and that product shouldn't just be given away for free. People should take both kind of social credit and physical credit money for their work. But you're never going to sell something to somebody who's poor. You're never going to sell something to somebody who doesn't need it. And selling entertainment has been a challenging thing to do. Now, as it turns out, entertainment hasn't collapsed. It just hasn't. It's actually grown quite significantly in popularity. Entertainment as let's call it a digitally copyable form. That market has boomed. It's probably the largest digitally distributable, let's say, wealth derived from the things that can be digitally distributed is by far the greatest avenue for transaction that humanity can presently conceive of. And it's only going to become more and more important that I don't even know what to say about it. That it's really, really important. And when we look back with a kind of 2020 hindsight, I see all those early, young, poor, because they're kids, right? They don't necessarily have jobs, summer jobs, anything like that, because they're in school or whatever. But piracy is fundamentally bad. And yet, those people, they grew up into adults, and those industries didn't collapse. Well, what happened in there? Well, as it turns out, myself, like many, many, many other people, would fall in love with certain things. And the later on opportunities would arise where there would be less and less pain for actually spending money on a real thing. We'd have something like a cross between more and more guilt and more economic ability, and it gets spent little by little on the stuff that we would normally pirate. And as it turns out, just that alone has been able to float the industry a little bit more and a little bit more. Now, of course, you've got an ever broadening body of people who will participate in the economics of online distribution. Got more and more innocent people who never would have thought about, don't know how to get software for free, get movies for free, get music for free, even if something is available. So there's an argument that expansion was an inevitability because of that, and it's always been a detriment, and there has never been a positive side to these, you can say, parasites to that industry, to that market. But I don't believe that's true. I don't believe it's true. I believe that there has been a kind of expansion from the poor youths out into a kind of spending in adulthood. I've seen that in myself, for example. I got some money, and one of the very first things I did was you wait for a sale. I would wait for a sale for Boxing Day, and I just spent a whole lot of money on DVDs. Again, back in the day. And so I want to pull that back to the early days of the sneaker net, the early days pre-internet. Things were being passed around. And back then there was a lot of fracturing of who developed the software, how it was distributed. And you would have a lot of really capable people making really good software, and the companies would fail. Now, not only would companies fail, they would move on, and they would abandon their old stuff. And so there became a term called abandonware, which is a ware. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what a ware is. So you could say somebody in a marketplace has wares for sale. So that's where the term comes from. And that idea had been already applied to piracy. And so you'd have people who would take existing commercial software and crack it so that it can be distributed and anybody could use it with the same serial number or with no serial number, etc., breaking through all the protections, letting it be copyable when it normally would be stuck on that floppy which was purchased and couldn't be copied, or etc., etc. So there were mechanisms out there creating an undercurrent of this software that was out there, but eventually all that software would become obsoleted or abandoned. The companies would go, the software would no longer be developed. This became especially true when people moved away. I'm just talking about what we incorrectly call PCs. I'm talking about from, let's say, the transition between DOS and Windows. Companies that once they fully transition into Windows, the vestiges of their early software would be left behind, left to rot. And a lot of people that use that old stuff, they didn't have the money for Windows, for example, for the latest version of Windows, for the latest software. They never did. They would still be stuck with this old stuff, and they would pass it around. And there was a kind of freedom from guilt when that old software company has officially abandoned the software, and it's still in use. It may be still in popular use, even commercially still in popular use, in that There are businesses out there who paid for it, who are using it for the foreseeable future, but they don't need to update it. Because again, a good piece of software would never need to be updated at all, ever. It serves its task perfectly, and you just use it, and that's your problem is solved by the software, and you get on with life. Nowadays, when things are internet connected, it's an excuse that I've talked about before, where you've got the hockey puck up to the deadline, where they rush to achieve something that's a release candidate, and then they push it further into the future with this incomplete piece of software with a lot of promises, and they will fix it because they have online updating. And so you got a lot of software with this online updating stuff that doesn't work, doesn't solve its problem completely, and will promise, and add more later, and do that as a way of marketing itself for people to get future updates. And so a lot of people get trapped into purchasing newer versions of software when the thing they bought solves the problem they have. And so there's an upgrade loop that's happening there that's feeding off of its existing customer base to try to turn a product into a revenue stream, which is, I mean, it's a good corrupt way of approaching the problem of getting money for nothing, turning a person from a one shot into a stream that goes straight from the amount of time and expertise they use in an employment and all that money, and just have like a little trickle of it siphoned off from them, as opposed to these one big blocks of things where they can walk away free. So if you're paying, for example, a rental fee on your operating system and on your antivirus software, which should be included, and on any other kind of optimization, or then you start getting into applications, well, your Office application, well, you're this, you're that, and you're getting tied down to just a portion of your paycheck is paid to this stuff, just so you can use your computer for whatever you want to use your computer for. So back then, there would be units of software, and they would be perfectly suited to their task. They would be done. They would work well enough. Everything could be improved. That's one of the things that drove me to learn programming. And but it turns out to be much more difficult to pull apart a closed source piece of software and fix it than you just don't have the time when you're a kid and you've got better things to do, and you're going to school and this kind of stuff. So I want to talk about the problem of source and updating a little bit later. So I'm talking back about the problem of companies abandoning perfectly good working software. And that's how a lot of people saw it, is there's this stuff that may or may not have a company protecting it, and it's being passed around. It's being passed around a culture that's very good at doing it. So you actually have a scene of people who do that partly as a status symbol, partly because they want to share, partly because they need it because they've got no money, etc. They legitimately have no money. They're not being stingy or anything. They would never have been a customer in the first place. And that's important to know, because there were a lot of arguments back then which go, those people are stealing, and this is the amount of revenue we could have gotten, and therefore piracy is bad to this dollar amount. Therefore anybody we catch owes us this much, because the number of instances of the number of times they shared a thing, which doesn't equal the number of people who use the thing. The number of times they shared the thing equals this number of dollars, when it's actually zero, because nobody down the chain ever would have paid money because they can't, because they're 12. So it's just never going to happen. Okay, maybe it's going to happen these days. Back then, there was no concept of kids paying money for this stuff. Now it's, Mom, can I have your credit card kind of thing. So abandonware was passed around, and there was a limited sense of guilt, if there was any at all. And Then there became this gray area, this kind of moral fog where these people were growing up, they would get access to money, and yet they still wouldn't pay for these things because there was a mature scene where they could just get stuff. Even now, I can go very easily and just download a version of that piece of software. And if it's you can say something like if its anti-piracy philosophies are incomplete, like if it's made as a product and not a service, turns out to be a little bit weird. If it's made as an individually downloadable product for a person who can then disconnect from the seller, then that disconnection can theoretically let that thing be bundled up and modified and then passed to the next computer and the next computer, which happens to have a different human. And so piracy can exist because of that fundamental mechanic. And if the person was forced to log in and some of the software was online, and sometimes all of the software is online, then you can be more assured of locking the human down to that person having access to a double authentication. So not just a password, which can be passed around, but also access to an email address, also restriction to a particular geographic area, as well as fingerprinting on the computer. And all of these mechanisms all put together make it too hard to make it so that you can just pass it around, and you just can't use it offline anyway. So there a lot of problems with that. But for software that can be passed around in that way and can be cracked around that way, it's easy. It's easy for me, not being in any kind of scene, to get stuff that it's quite new, that's passed freely. But I, having some means, have the ability to use that to go and pirate something and then look at the software and go, hey, this is a good piece of software. This is worth money. What I downloaded was just kind of like an older version of the program, not that old. Sometimes it's very up to date. And I'll look at it and go, okay, yeah, this is good. I'll go buy it. That's kind of the culture we're getting into now. But there was still this, and there still is this gray area where people do have money, but they pirate anyway. And in that same attitude, there's this concept of abandonware, which might have been legitimate way back when, and that moral grayness had more and more people pirating when they didn't need to. And what they were doing, the mental gymnastics they were doing was, well, this is an old version of the software that's not being updated anymore. Therefore, it's been abandoned, which is linguistically, it's true. And they say that, well, they're not updating it, so it's okay. So I'm okay. The little sins, I'm okay with that. I wouldn't have been their customer anyway. They don't sell that for my version of their operating system. I'm only doing this little bit of it. I'm not doing the whole complete functionality of the software anyway. I need to go spend my money on this stuff, or right. I'm working a soup kitchen, right? I volunteer, therefore the goodness here and the badness here, and right, the little sins, right? It's just people do that. So there's this idea of labeling a piece of software as abandoned when it is still the intellectual property of some company out there. Not even if it's not in development anymore, it's very likely that these days a piece of intellectual property is owned by somebody. And some of this stuff is very boldly traded around, very boldly. And the culture has been allowed to exist because each instance of this piracy, this actually authentically illegal action, each instance cannot be legally pursued by the owner of the copyright, because each instance isn't a the return on investment of protecting the intellectual property doesn't exist for me going and shutting down that tiny little website that only has a little bit of this, and that other website that has only a little bit of that. And there's an equivalent of like the little sin that lets the owner of that, like the lawful owner of that, not really choose to own all of it all the time. They kind of, the problem of economics means they're forced to not pursue certain things. And as soon as the target gets big enough, they kind of have a legal obligation to pursue it. I've talked about something like World of Warcraft and its lawyers taking down a private pirated copy of an old version of their game. And it got taken down. And a lot of the justifications was, well, you guys don't have it anymore. You guys, these are not really your users because they're using an old version of your software. You don't make it anymore. Hey, they pay money if you did it, but you choose not to. So they're not really taking away from any product that you have. And the mental gymnastics of calling it abandoned, and Blizzard went and took them down because they were big. They were too big, and the return on investment of sicking lawyers on that problem, or rather the lawyers were already there protecting the intellectual property, so they did it because they get paid to do that, so they went and did it, and it was big enough for them to justify the bill. And most companies under most of these, on the littler examples, won't get pursued. It's just not economically feasible. So you have out there this kind of like limited piracy, and it's not, and there's stuff that's out there that is abandoned and it is owned by somebody or other. So if I were to pass around a pirated copy of the old BIOS operating system, and it was one, and it's amazing. Like it was amazing. It was better than anything else that could have been conceived of by humans. And but it failed as a company, failed as a product. It's gone. But its intellectual property was swept up and picked up by Palm Incorporated, I believe. And so it's owned out there. But you can imagine that somebody would be passing around the authentic original thing, but nobody would, and they think, oh, it's abandoned. But it's not. Somebody owns the rights to this stuff, and they are breaking the law. So there's a lot of that out there. And there must, for as long as lawyers are expensive and the process is difficult, there will always be a small undercurrent of that piracy. Always. And a lot of people will argue that, like, from an archivist perspective, good. I want that human effort to not fade into dust in the vaults of companies that will never release that product again. Will never do the afternoon's effort to re-release something. It'll just rot and be forgotten by time. It'll only exist in Let's Play videos or whatever the hell, and that's that human effort is gone. That the data is gone. And what I would really like to change, I have a big problem that I've talked about before about things not lapsing into public domain. Okay, so a copyright, a patent, in the intellectual property of something or other never gets from private corporate control out into the public space where it can be used far more freely. Right now, there might be some laws kinda around free use, but that's a difficult thing for people to actually pursue properly, because the platforms that they release their stuff on protect themselves unnecessarily and are unduly harsh on people making what's the term, they're adding value to an existing property, and they're actually using fair use. Like, they're objectively using fair use, but the platform can't take risks. They can, because they're actually legally allowed to, but they choose to not take risks. And so the mechanism to make public domain, the mechanism to make fair use content is really broken. And so there needs to be something that forces that stuff to be public domain so that it can be used. And nobody has any excuses because it's public. Right now, we've got, in many places, an intellectual property, a product that can be renewed for forever, for the lifespan of a corporation, which is immortal, which I also disagree with. And so a product can be released and re-released in, it's this version that's a 3D, it's a commercial, it's a short film in black and white, and then it was released as a cartoon, and then it was released as a 3D animated version, then it was reimagined with new technology, and there's a live action version of it, and then there's the 3D IMAX version of it, and it's just like from simple roots, it has grown into this big thing, and all along it is for taking a product and making it immortal. And all along that for some reason, that thing back then gets included in the ownership, but that thing back then, like that old piece of software, should lapse into the public domain, should eventually be legitimately considered abandoned in a more legal sense, and that should be redistributable freely with no concept of no concept of legal problems. And we don't do that in media. We don't have mechanisms to do that in media because we protect corporations too much. And we have no concept of that in software, again, because it's part of protecting a corporate product. And so you've got this underground of people that are actually legitimately breaking the law. Now, there's stuff out there that we don't even know if it's public domain. There was a product that was made. It was copyrighted. It might have been pirated. Well, it was definitely pirated at the time. The company went away, and nobody can figure out who owns that product. Like, nobody. It's just in this weird legal gray area. We don't really have a way of knowing, because it was copyrighted. Okay, so maybe it can lapse into the public domain, but how long does that take? There's nobody who can defend it legally and be in the legal right. So doesn't it mean that it becomes public domain the day after? What if the company, it doesn't exist, but it was bought by other things, and yet nobody can figure out who bought who and how things broke apart and who actually owns the copyright to this thing? Like, who? Well, so what do? You pass it around, and maybe one day out of nowhere somebody will say, oh yeah, I've got that copyright, that whatever. So there's kind of a risk there, I suppose, but who would care if it's this little obsolete old thing? Like, if there's a market that never would have paid money for it. One of the arguments isn't that something should just lapse into the public domain. There's an argument that says, well, wouldn't it be nice if there was a registry for all software where the source code for that software was logged and encrypted or whatever the heck, kept safe, so that when its ownership expires, however that's described, the software it elapses into the public domain. And that wouldn't just let the program be out there. It may or may not be usable because some of the software is for a different platform entirely and the world has moved on. But smart people can figure that stuff out. But if you release the source code, smart people can really figure that stuff out. And it isn't the product that becomes available to humanity. It is the effort, the underlying, a more pure version of what humans spent time on, the idea underneath the the software, the problem solving itself gets put out there for humans to use. And if that becomes public domain, that can be pulled apart, that can be reused, that can help optimize future efforts. And you can imagine that there would be a trail, even if it takes 20 years, there would be a trail of the open source software for this freely available, like freedom libre of this software, and then this software, and then this software, and then this software. And then you get this cone of availability of software. And you can imagine some person in the future in an impossibly well organized system could look at this huge, ever increasing cone of freely available public domain work and just pull apart and make their own thing, which is a new version of a stitched together version of all that public domain stuff that they can wrap up, they can make proprietary, but they can log the source code. And when they are disinterested in it, the owner dies, the corporation dies because they should have a lifespan, the patent expires because it should have a reasonable lifespan. It can be committed back into humanity. And we don't have to have everything locked down in secret and only very occasionally have things kind of pirated sometimes. And that's how the problem solving software gets out there. Instead, it would be nice if the underlying ideas, the underlying methods of solving the problems gets put out there so it can be reworked for that same problem in a different context with a different platform, a different operating system. So I find it, I like the idea of considering something abandonware, even though it is a slippery slope that leads into a kind of a gray area that becomes more and more illegal, but people kind of can't legally pursue their ownership, that it goes from poor child into a kind of a poor company that can't protect their stuff. I think there needs to be some mechanism by which it's more okay to be in there, and yet when something is locked down, there should be a mechanism by which those chains get broken and the software gets more officially released as having been abandoned. And it's a beautiful dream to think that source code could be that's never going to happen. The source thing is never going to happen. So those are my thoughts on that.